So, in your past work, you said that sexual violence is a theme that is over-theorized and under-historicized. So I'm very glad to see you do this comparative 20th century study and historicize for us. And I'm wondering if you can share what are some of these creative ways you're using to get information on a subject that is not documented well. And also, I think this may be of interest to some people who are not historians in the room, are any of these methods applicable to documenting sexual violence today, in particular sexual violence against men?
Can be, yes. In terms of the sort of non-obvious places where you might look, am I able to be heard okay? Good. The less obvious places where you might look, when you go back in time, trying to find information on rape and sexual assault, it's rarely advertised as such. So sometimes you have to come at it from kind of left-brain perspective. One of the things that, for example, rampant sexual violence tends to do is to create public health crises. Lots of people who are experiencing physical trauma as a result of sexual violence, unwanted pregnancy, sexually transmitted disease, and so forth. So, funnily enough, one of the first places that I'm likely to go to kind of get a handle on what's going on is the records of the Ministry of Health, that kind of thing. Fairly obviously, you're going to find some material in criminal justice records, but very infrequently ones that result in prosecutions. So you're looking at the dead files, so to speak, of complaints that were brought forward and then were kind of laughed at. A lot of very good work was done, peculiarly enough, by war crimes trials investigators that never went anywhere and have been sitting there gathering dust for 60 or 70 years, because it wasn't until after the War of Yugoslav Succession in the 1990s that war-related rape became an international offense. So absolute ton of stuff done by UN investigators, a lot of stuff done by Australian investigators. I had to go to Canberra to see that on what the Japanese were doing in places like Borneo and Solomon Islands. A lot of stuff done by the US Army that, as I say, never went anywhere because nobody prosecuted. So it's amazing what you can find when you go looking. But you have to, as I say, look in the awkward places. Again, if you're going to pull down, let's say, something like the New York Times or the London Times newspapers, or the Figaro, or for that matter, the Volksche Debatte, you're not going to get a lot of stuff there. But local newspapers, the smaller the better. For them, something like this is a big deal. So when I wanted to put together a kind of enormous and unwieldy database of civilian sexual offending, I was reading little advertiser free sheets for a town of 2,500 that would give you chapter and verse, none of which ever made the national news.
I'm trying to apply this to sort of, I learned from you that 37% of sexual victimization in Congo is against men. Now, as somebody who works on African policy, politics and the DRC, and I know how much funding goes into sexual victimization of women in Congo, right? I had no idea about this very high percentage, 37%. And I'm wondering, why have we missed that? And sort of how many problems are we creating for future historians and for people who currently are in Congo by missing that? And so you would say maybe public health records?
That and other things. One of the, when we're talking about contemporary conflict-related sexual violence, and there the dynamics are slightly different from the historical cases, because often the information does exist, but it's, as it were, misclassified. You have a situation in which violence, conflict-related violence against women involving genitalia is inevitably and invariably sexual violence by definition. Whereas a lot of similar offences against men get classified as something else, either torture or grievous bodily harm, assault, whatever it might be. And this is especially the case where, with a lot of conflict-related offending, there isn't an obvious, this is not necessarily something done for sexual pleasure on the part of the perpetrator. It is done as a form of collective punishment. It can be done as a form of promoting forced migration or ethnic cleansing to drive people out of a particular area. It can be done as a form of anti-insurgent activity. One of the things, for example, that the security forces in Syria and Iran and Lebanon, and Libya, are specializing at the moment is neutralizing male political opponents by female political opponents too, but I suppose numbers-wise probably predominantly male, by bringing them in, sexually violating them in detention, filming what's being done, and then threatening the individual concerned. If we hear another peep out of you, this is going up on YouTube. And that's a very effective way of turning opponents of the regime into biased people. So, again, it's there if you look for it, but you're not going to find it advertised as such.
Continuing on this topic of conflict-related sexual violence, and today we talk about political scientists and how we categorize rape, and sort of that makes me think of NLO and the recreational rape, the national security rape, and the genocidal rape. But then in your other scholarship, you have warned against how categorizing can also homogenize people's experiences and can lead to victim Olympics, so that somebody who's a victim of genocidal rape is somehow considered more of a victim than somebody of recreational rape.
Yeah, and this is something that is a problem for victims of both sexes. Last year, I brought a bunch of my students at Colgate to meet with women who had been in one of the so-called rape camps in the former Yugoslavia in Bosnia. And I should say, by the way, that the rape camp was not an invention of the 1990s. They were all over the place in Central and Eastern Europe in the 1940s. But one of the things that my students found disconcerting when they met these survivors of really gruesome carceral sexual violence is that the women themselves did not think that this was either A, the worst thing that had happened to them in many cases, or B, that its effects were the biggest problem they were dealing with at the moment. They were saying things like, my kid is graduating from high school next year and there's no jobs, and that's what I'm concerned about now. But all the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, want to talk about is what happened to me in Foggia or Moscow or whatever it might be. And that's not my concern. My concern is getting access to decent health care or whatever it might be. So, yeah, this kind of categorization can, what was it you said, the new version of the ideal victim or the perfect victim narrative, in which our sort of early 21st century gender logics had sexual violence as the very top of the kind of list of atrocities that one can experience and almost everything else is related to that, not what actually occurs. But in terms of what political scientists are doing, I'm speaking as a historian, and part of the reason that we're in this fix, so to speak, is that the historical profession, present company accepted, really hasn't been out there doing a lot of cutting-edge work in this field. And it tends to be political scientists, people like Elizabeth Wood, people like R.K. Cohen of Harvard and so forth, who are really doing absolutely first-rate comparative, broad analyses of sexual violence across countries, cultures, races, ethnicities, and testing our conventional wisdom to see how much of it actually holds up. And it turns out a heck of a lot of it doesn't. Sub-Saharan Africa is not the rape capital of the world. The kind of correlates that you might expect to find of places that have lots of sexual offending and little sexual offending, not the ones that we think. We keep running up against asymmetrical conflicts where, for example, one side, the Sinhalese Tamil conflict in Sri Lanka as a case in point, uses sexual violence as an instrument on an industrial scale, and the other, for whatever reason, even though they're happy to violate human rights in all manner of respects, doesn't. And how do we go about explaining that? So, I think one of the things that historians actually are good at is sweating the specificities. And let's say that the broad typologies, the models, often don't hold up terribly well when you start digging around underneath them.
And talking about specificities and giving agency to victims. In your memoir, in addition to his award-winning books, Ray has a memoir on being raped, and you explain why you prefer to use the word victim rather than survivor, because for you it comes closest to the heart of the matter, is what you say. And so here, as a political scientist, when I write, I often have the difficulty of choosing which term to apply for people that I have not met, and I cannot ask these individuals what they prefer. And then I was thinking that your job is even more difficult because often you are victims or survivors who passed away. So what do we do about this in history and political science and others?
Yeah, it's a huge problem, one that I'm conscious of, because, and of course, being conscious of it does not mean that I know how to fix it. It's one thing to know that you have blind spots, but the nature of blind spots is that you don't know where those blind spots are. Are aware that they exist out there somewhere. And usually you fire somebody else to slap you around and say, hey, doofus. That's not really how it is. But Dr. Freitas, of course, discussed the same kind of thing earlier on. What happens when your experiential knowledge and your academic knowledge either work in sync or worse, don't, or seem to be doing the two things simultaneously but on different levels. It's really, really hard to avoid forcing the messy complexities of the past onto the Procrustean bed of our own theoretical conceptions. There isn't an obvious way out of that, because as I say, we can't see what we can't see, but all I think that one can reasonably do is emphasize, lay one's cards face up on the table for the reader, the immense level of provisionality to the knowledge we produce or claim to recover. Whenever I hear somebody saying that I'm here to give a voice to the voiceless, confiscate sharp implements and boot laces.
It's the gesture that makes it so fabulous.
Okay, I'm also wondering if you're willing to share some of the what and whys that you've been finding that your presentation alludes to. Sort of, I'm very fascinated to find out more about, you say that sexual violence was more prevalent in cases where the perpetrators knew that they were not going to be living together with the victims. And that's something that in some ways can be expected, but in others, no, because often perpetrators and victims come from the exact same community and continue to live in that community. So maybe what you found and why, and also, you ended by saying the Red Army committed horrific crimes in certain countries and not in others, and of course I don't know. I think that is.
Well, as regards the first, there is, I think, almost an umbilical connection between forced population movements, quote-unquote ethnic cleansing, which is always ethnic, sometimes it's racial, sometimes it's other things, but creating facts on the ground and really broad-scale sexual offending on a kind of industrial scale. We certainly see that in Central and Eastern Europe in the 1940s, as I say. You saw it in the Soviet Union with the Nazis. You see it to a considerable extent, but I don't think quite as marked an extent in the Pacific region in the Second World War as you did in the European region, but you definitely see it all over the place in Africa and the Middle East at the present time. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes it's as simple as the fact that, as I say, violences, interpersonal violences, are interconnected and embedded. And where you are deliberately trying to create a state of lawlessness and chaos, then it's a much more, shall I say, rape-friendly environment than one where, for whatever reason, you're trying to introduce even, as I say, a coercive or exploitative hierarchy between ruler and ruled, colonizer and colonized, but you still want some sort of predictability going on. Second question, sorry, the second aspect of the split number.
The second one was about the Red Army.
Sure. Why it is that it happens in some places. Hungary was an ex-enemy country from the point of view of the Red Army, and the brutalities that took place there. We're only beginning to get our heads around the sheer awfulness of it, but for my money, worse than anything done, if it's possible to quantify these things, it probably isn't, but anything that the people like Marta Hillers were describing in Berlin in May 1945. Bulgaria, a neighboring ex-enemy country, except Bulgaria screwed up its position of switching sides just at the end of the war. For 3 delirious days, the Bulgarians managed to be at war with the Axis and the Allies simultaneously, which was a unique achievement on their parts. But a place where you would expect, the Red Army to do to enemies what it did everywhere else. And short answer seems to be command authority. The Soviet military commander in Bulgaria said and made clear to his troops down the line, listen you XYZs, I don't give a damn how annoyed you are at these people. This is absolutely not happening on my watch, and you XYZs are behind me if I hear that it does. And basically it didn't. In more modern conflicts, we've found that kind of layered command authority, it's no point just issuing a proclamation and then leaving it at that, but making sure that the intermediate commanders all the way down to the top sergeant to the bottom knows that unpleasant consequences are going to follow in discipline. When you do this, it doesn't completely eliminate all sexual offending, but compared to when you don't, chalk and cheese.
So, do you feel that, or did you find that sort of these differing results and actions by the Red Army or different armies in the regions also resulted in different kind of relationship? Sort of how important is sexual violence in the relationship between the countries?
Between the military and civilians, was case in point. Complicated question. I mean, one of the great problems for embedding communism at the end of the Second World War in countries that were traditionally violently resistant to it, like Poland, intensely anti-communist, intensely anti-Russian, where the Communist Party was actually wound up before 1939 because by that point they were able to hold their annual convention in a commodious telephone kiosk. How it is that you then have the Red Army coming in, raping people left and right, well, Polish women and girls left and right, at the precise time that you're trying to convince the Polish population of the blessings of Soviet rule. And this was taken up even to the level of Stalin himself. Stalin's answer was essentially, cry me a river, knock yourself out, guys. So there's an immense amount of self-defeating component to this too. But when we turn our attention to the Western allies in the war, there is a whole other story right there. Certainly what US soldiers did, and I'm contributing, I suppose, a little bit to the scholarship in that, both against female and male victims, and if you get into the court-martial records, again, there are certain left-hand ways around it. You find plenty of those cases too. The level of, I suppose, indiscrimination, if that is actually a word, between enemies or supposed enemies or professed enemies and one's own people is absolutely startling. Same true of Britain, and to the best of my knowledge, nothing at all has been written about, you want to talk about the greatest generation, quote unquote, in this country. You just cannot talk at all about sexual offending by British servicemen during the Second World War. And yet, once again, both against fellow citizens, enemies, but also allies. There's a massive story there that nobody has even got a little bit under the surface, never mind really delved into. As I say, I have been doing a little bit of work to try and gauge what happens to civilians when a society becomes militarized. And following what especially happens in the criminal justice system. One of the interesting things, by the way, just on Professor Coker's point, and something that I didn't expect to find, and actually a little bit disappointed that I did, my instincts are to be very punitive and retributive, when it comes to sex offenders, hang them, and then flog them, and then hang them again. But one of the things I did discover, and when I looked at sexual offending by civilians against civilians in several countries in wartime, any conviction at all, even if it resulted in the proverbial slap in the wrist, and very often it went no further than that, it's astonishing how often that turned out to scare people straight up. There are certain, degenerates who are offending over and over again. The only time they stop is when they're in prison. But I was astonished because I spent a lot of time following these people's careers, 40 or 50 years later to see what they were doing next. And, if they got the equivalent of a $20 fine and time served in better than 90% of cases, the criminal justice system never heard of them again. Doesn't necessarily mean that they never offended again, but they certainly weren't doing it at the level that would attract the attention of the authorities. So, surprising, but history is a nasty way of blowing up your preconceptions.
Okay, we are out of time, so I'm going to open up the floor to the floor.
I have one observation and one question, and they're both brief. One thing that I think is very interesting is that historians often have a difficult time offering a prescription for moving forward. We're not in the business of that. But one thing that I think is really interesting about your observation about the Red Army in Bulgaria, and something that was mentioned in Kat's book, is that here are two, she offered this example about SNCC, how there's pervasive sexual harassment. There's a lot of pressure on African American women not to report sexual assault. However, you found one exception, and I can't remember where it was. Was it in Alabama?
She was in Mississippi, Laurel, Mississippi.
And if I'm remembering the anecdote correctly, you attributed the lack of sexual assault and sexual harassment in one particular chapter due to a very powerful chapter president who put the kibosh on it, who spoke out very forcefully, saying, "I will not tolerate this within the organization." And I think it's very interesting that you found this example of like this one exceptional leader and the role that can play in a culture that's corrupt to its core.
Right.
So just a fascinating connection.
Also Yugoslavia, there wasn't a powerful military commander saying we're not going to do this. It was a lot of very bad-tempered Yugoslav partisans, many of whom were female with guns, saying, "You guys step out of line, it's on."
And then my question is very brief. One thing that you mentioned was that if you sought to do research using the New York Times or the London Times, you would have just hit dead ends. You wouldn't have found much evidence. However, when you turned your attention to smaller newspapers, local newspapers, a story began to emerge. And I'm just curious to know what kind of evidence you found in those newspapers that was helpful.
That's the fascinating thing in and of itself. The class dimension came out very strongly indeed. Over and over again, I mean, I'm in the business of putting together a bloody great Excel spreadsheet, which is horrible for two reasons. One, I'm completely clueless of technology. Two, Excel is horrible. But if you do if you order things under occupation, just about always it is manual labor, private soldier, ordinary seaman, so on and so forth. Hardly ever does anybody middle class or better get hauled before the courts. When somebody middle class or better gets hauled before the courts, invariably they get. So class dimension is strongly marked. As I say, if you plot geographies of violence and start putting pins in the map, that's often a fascinating thing too, because you find big clusters that are not necessarily correlated with clusters of population. And then you have to start digging down and thinking, well, what's going on here? Well, one of the things that you might find if you look there is a lot of people coming in from another part of the country. So especially if there's a big munitions factory, now you've got 2,000 girls and young women living in a hastily constructed workers' hostel on a muddy field on the edge of town, and bright-eyed, clueless, lots of money in their pockets, not much to spend at home except anti-stress syrup in the evening. There's a whole bunch of stories that can be told about that. So, when you do that kind of number crunching, but that requires you to be half a geographer. And I'm doing it in the most half-assed, clueless way, such that the only conclusions that I'm drawing from are the kind that, beat any idiot over a head, and they're going to be able to see how somebody who does this kind of thing for a living is going to let out all manner of insights that goes to me.
I'm interested in your speculation. I'm from southern Arizona. We have a very high concentration of prisons and detention centers, virtually right on the border. These centers are predominantly privately owned. And I guess my question is, in our contemporary time, I'm just sure we're setting up massive numbers of women, particularly, to be raped or otherwise mistreated as they try to get into Mexico, as they're detained in Mexico trying to get in the U.S., and of these kids and families that are, I can't imagine this is the kind of staff where they keep going to work every day in a place even though the government has said these people don't have a right to have basic vaccinations.
Yeah. Detention facilities, especially detention facilities associated with mass involuntary population movements, are factories of sexual predation. They are pretty much where we go. Some of the Central and Eastern European rape camps, as I say, especially in Poland, to some extent in Czechoslovakia in 45, 46, 47, 48, you saw that on an extraordinary scale. I described them in print as sexual supermarkets, and that's really how they function, not just for the staff, but also for people who were invited from the local town to come along, check somebody out for the weekend, take them home, do with them what they would, and bring them back on Monday morning, that kind of thing. So yes, we will, the more we dig down into that, the more bad things we're going to find. I will say that so far as prison sexual offending is concerned, prison rape, and one of the peculiarities of the United States, I'm not American, as you probably gathered from the accent, I'm not a citizen, I'm from Ireland, though my wife and daughter are authentic Americans. But this is so much more a North American thing, well, not a North American, it is so much a United States thing, as compared to other parts of the developed world. You just do not see that kind of thing on anything like scale in French prisons or British prisons or Swiss prisons. You do see it in these impromptu refugee camps like the so-called Calais jungle and places like this. But in terms of American ordinary prisons, whether privately run or federal or state, the only good thing that came out of the Prison Rape Elimination Act is we're starting to get really good survey data from prisoners themselves, both people serving their time, but much more importantly, people who have completed their sentences and moved on. And that is changing our picture of what sexual offending in prison looks like, and who's affected and who's perpetrated. The stereotypes that you see, I'm in Louisiana, the 250-pound cellmate of Bubba, who is a supposed stereotypical rapist. In the prison circuits, it's the COs, the correctional officers. You're much more likely to be a victim of sexual violence by one of the correctional officers who can write you up, take away your good time, or provide you with privileges, both licit and illicit, if they please. Much more likely to have that happen than to be attacked by a cellmate. I went on a bit longer than I really should have. Apologies.
Well, what you just said about prison rape is so interesting to me. I guess I would have thought that this was, that prison rape was happening in many other countries. Is there do you know whether there's perhaps a relationship to the degree of violence that's happening more generally? Are U.S. prisons more violent?
I think it's broader than that. I think it's strongly cultural. It's not that, for example, I spend a lot of time in Switzerland for a variety of reasons, but if you want to get into places where you don't expect material and sexual violence to be, get into the archives of the Red Cross in Geneva, because every trouble spot in the world in the last 100 years, they've had somebody in the ground. And it's amazing how little that archive is used. But in a country like Switzerland, they're not necessarily more pro-criminal, so to speak, in the United States, but they consider it absolutely shameful to abdicate control of their correctional institutions to other prisoners, simply to say we're going to wash our hands of what happens there and leave the inmates to police themselves, that kind of thing. They would say if you cannot do that, then you need to be getting out of the prison business altogether. What's different about this country, I think, is the degree of lip-smacking satisfaction that good, decent people feel at the prospect of criminals, even non-violent criminals, experiencing sexual violation behind bars. You may recall the Enron collapse, and just as a typical case in point, and this guy, Kenneth Lay, I believe, who was the guy responsible for it. The Attorney General of California, the highest law enforcement officer in that state, went on, I believe it was Facebook, I don't think Twitter had yet been invented, posting how he was looking forward to Ken Lay getting raped in prison. As I say, this is a guy whose job it is to uphold the law in the state of California. You look at any local newspaper, the comments section on somebody who's been done for shoplifting. Well, I hope, he doesn't, or she, horrifically, doesn't bend over or drop the soap in the showers because Bubba's going to take it. This kind of thing is absolutely, it's in South Park, it's in Simpsons, it's in Bugs Bunny, for God's sake. There is an episode of Bugs Bunny where Yosemite Sam, this guy, the shooting guy, is kind of conned into chasing Bugs Bunny into a jail cell that is then slammed behind him, and there's this enormous simpering southern gentleman who starts moving in on him. And that's, I suppose, a kind of double entendre, so that the parents watching along with the kids can get their yucks as well. As I say, speaking as an outsider to this country, you really don't find that kind of thing in other cultures. It's peculiarly American.